There is a particular kind of suffering that doesn't look like collapse. It looks like competence. You function. You think clearly. You understand yourself better than most people ever try to. And yet something in you remains strangely untouched by life, as if your days are happening near you rather than through you. You tell yourself you're not stuck. You're preparing, refining, waiting for the moment when acting will feel honest. But the moment keeps moving, and your inner world keeps getting sharper, and somehow that sharpness becomes the reason you don't move. It isn't fear in the obvious sense. It's something more unsettling. The sense that motion will reveal what you are actually made of, and once that is revealed, what happens to everything you still believe you could be? The paralysis that doesn't come from fear, but from excess awareness. There is a kind of paralysis that doesn't announce itself as fear. It doesn't feel dramatic or urgent, and it rarely looks like avoidance. It settles quietly, almost politely, as if it were the result of intelligence doing its job too well. Nothing is blocked by panic. Everything is held back by awareness, an awareness so sharp that every possible action arrives already surrounded by consequences. This state is often mistaken for maturity. After all, reflection is praised, hesitation is framed as wisdom, and restraint is rewarded socially. But at a certain point, thinking stops being preparation and becomes containment. Not because the person lacks courage, but because the mind refuses to leave anything unresolved. Every move feels heavy before it even begins. What paralyzes here is not the risk of failure, but the clarity of context. The person sees the systems, the expectations, the interpretations, the ripple effects. They sense how fragile meaning can be, how easily actions are misunderstood or diminished. The world appears too complex to enter casually, so movement begins to feel irresponsible unless it is perfectly justified. In this condition, consciousness no longer illuminates the path forward. It floods it. Details accumulate faster than decisions can form. The mind stays alert, scanning for coherence, timing, alignment, and in doing so, it quietly postpones experience itself. What emerges is a strange suspension of life, not inactivity, but perpetual readiness. A sense of standing just before the moment when things finally make sense enough to begin. And yet that moment never arrives. Because clarity keeps asking for more clarity before allowing motion. So the unsettling question is not whether fear is holding you back. It is whether awareness, once meant to deepen your presence, has become the most subtle reason you remain still. When intelligence itself becomes a mechanism of delay. At some point, intelligence stops functioning as a tool and begins to behave like a filter. Not a filter that refines action, but one that postpones it. Every idea is examined before it is allowed to exist fully. Every impulse is intercepted by analysis, weighed against long-term coherence, internal consistency, imagined outcomes. Nothing moves forward without first passing through an internal tribunal. This is not overthinking in the superficial sense. It is something quieter, more disciplined, almost principled. A commitment to not being naive, not being premature, not being exposed. The mind insists on readiness before action, but its definition of readiness keeps expanding. What once required understanding now demands certainty. In this space, intelligence begins to protect identity rather than serve experience. To act is to reveal limits. To choose is to exclude alternatives. And so the intellect keeps options open by delaying commitment, mistaking possibility for freedom. Movement is postponed in the name of preserving depth. There is a subtle pride hidden here, not arrogance, but a silent belief that action should reflect the full complexity one perceives. Anything less feels reductive, even dishonest. So the person waits, not out of laziness, but out of loyalty to nuance. Yet nuance, when endlessly respected, can quietly erode momentum. Over time, intelligence turns inward. It begins to study itself, studying. Decisions are no longer about the world, but about whether one's internal position is sufficiently justified. The question is no longer, what should be done, but is this version of me ready to be seen doing it? And that question rarely reaches a conclusion. Perhaps the deeper tension is this: when did understanding become a prerequisite for living rather than something shaped by it? And what parts of experience are silently sacrificed while the mind waits to feel worthy of action? The quiet suspicion that any movement will reveal limits. As awareness sharpens, another feeling begins to surface, rarely named, rarely confronted. It is not fear of failure in the ordinary sense. It is the suspicion that action once taken will make something irreversible visible, that moving forward will expose the exact boundary between what is imagined and what is real, and that boundary, once seen, cannot be unseen. Potential is safe precisely because it remains undefined. It carries no shape that can be measured, no edge that can be tested. As long as something stays internal, it can remain vast, elastic, untouched by proof. Action, however, compresses possibility into form. It turns inner richness into something finite, exposed to comparison. This creates a quiet hesitation that feels almost ethical, as if acting too soon would be a kind of betrayal, not of others, but of the more expansive version of oneself that still exists in thought. The person delays not because they doubt their capacity, but because they sense that any concrete step will reduce them to a single outline. Here, limitation feels more threatening than failure. Failure can be explained, contextualized, reframed. Limits are harder to negotiate. They suggest not a mistake, but a structure, a point beyond which effort no longer expands possibility. So movement becomes charged with existential weight. Each decision feels like a declaration of what one truly is, rather than a temporary experiment. And in that framing, staying still feels safer than discovering the truth of one's range. Not because the truth would be devastating, but because it would be final in a way thought never is. The unspoken tension lingers beneath the surface. Is inaction really a form of protection, or is it a way of keeping identity suspended, untested, unconfirmed, and therefore endlessly intact? The habit of observing oneself until the impulse to act dissolves. Over time, awareness does not remain directed outward. It turns inward, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The mind begins to watch itself thinking, feeling, hesitating. Every impulse is noticed the moment it appears, labeled, interpreted, placed into context. Nothing is allowed to rise without being immediately understood. At first, this self-observation feels like depth, a sign of maturity, of psychological sophistication. To know oneself is considered a form of control, even of freedom. But there is a subtle shift that often goes unnoticed when observation replaces participation. The moment an impulse is examined, it changes. Its rawness fades, its urgency softens. What could have moved the body forward becomes an object of reflection instead. The person does not suppress desire, they analyze it until it loses its momentum. This creates a strange internal distance. One is always slightly outside the experience, commenting on it rather than inhabiting it. Action starts to feel crude, almost intrusive, as if it interrupts a more refined internal process. Gradually, life becomes something that is interpreted rather than lived. Moments are assessed for meaning before they are allowed to unfold. Emotions are traced to their origins before they are fully felt. And in this constant self-referencing loop, the original impulse rarely survives intact. What remains is a polished stillness, not numbness, but restraint, shaped by insight. The person knows why they hesitate, knows what is happening internally, yet that knowledge does not restore movement. It only makes the immobility more articulate, and so the question lingers beneath the awareness itself. At what point does self-understanding stop deepening experience and begin to quietly drain it of its force? The imaginary comparison to ideal versions that never existed. Once the mind becomes accustomed to watching itself, it starts producing a second self. Not a deliberate invention, not a fantasy in the obvious sense, but a quiet internal figure. More composed, more consistent, more ready. A version of you who would have acted at the right time, with the right words in the right direction, without hesitation. This version is never fully described, which is why it remains powerful. It exists in outlines, in impressions, in what you could have been if circumstances were cleaner, if energy was steadier, if confidence arrived without needing to be earned. And because it has never been tested, it can remain flawless. The comparison rarely feels like comparison. It feels like standards, like dignity, like refusing to settle for something smaller than what you sense is possible. But the ideal self is not merely higher. It is unreal in a specific way. It is built from edited moments, from imagined continuity, from a life that never had friction. So real action starts to feel insulting to the ideal. Drafts feel embarrassing. Attempts feel premature. The imperfect beginning feels like a stain, as if the first step should already carry the elegance of mastery. This is how capable people become quietly ashamed of ordinary progress. They do not lack ambition, they lack permission to be unfinished, not because they think perfection is attainable, but because their mind keeps comparing the raw present to a version of themselves that was never forced into reality. And the most unsettling part is that the ideal self is not an enemy. It is made from longing, from sensitivity to what could be meaningful, from an instinct for depth and coherence. Yet it can still function like a silent pressure, turning every real movement into evidence of not being enough. So the question is not whether you should have higher standards. It is whether your standards are actually pointing toward life, or toward a mental image that can never be met because it was never alive. The tension between perceived potential and lived action. As the gap widens, it becomes harder to ignore. On one side, there is a vivid sense of what could be done, what might be expressed, built, pursued. On the other, there is the modest reality of what has actually moved, what has taken form, what has left a trace. This tension is not loud. It does not announce itself as frustration or despair. It settles as a low, persistent hum beneath daily life. A sense that one's inner landscape is richer than the visible marks it has made on the world. Potential begins to feel heavier than action, because potential carries expectation without limitation. It suggests a debt that has not yet been paid, a promise that remains suspended. Every day without movement adds weight to what is imagined but unrealized. Action, in contrast, appears small, concrete, exposed to judgment, revision, and failure. It can never fully express the depth that preceded it, and so it feels, almost by definition, disappointing. Here the conflict is not between ambition and laziness. It is between fidelity to an inner sense of richness and the bluntness of reality's demands. To act is to accept reduction, to accept that something vast must become specific and therefore incomplete. Many capable people remain caught in this space, not stuck exactly, but suspended. They prepare, refine, think, adjust. They wait for a form of action that will finally feel proportional to the complexity they carry inside. And so the question quietly sharpens: is potential meant to be preserved, or is it meant to be spent, even if the spending never looks like what was imagined? The peculiar guilt of not living up to what one understands. At a certain point, the tension turns inward and takes on a moral tone, not imposed from outside, not shaped by rules or expectations, but born from a quiet awareness of one's own understanding. You know what matters. You recognize patterns, traps, illusions, and that knowledge, instead of liberating, begins to accuse. This guilt is difficult to explain because it doesn't come from wrongdoing. It comes from discrepancy, from sensing that one's clarity exceeds one's movement. That insight has outpaced embodiment. The mind has already arrived somewhere the rest of life has not followed. There is something unsettling about knowing better and not acting differently. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, cumulative moments. Each hesitation feels heavier when it is conscious. Each delay feels less innocent when it has been understood from the inside. The person does not feel ignorant, they feel internally inconsistent. This is not the guilt of failure, which can be externalized and repaired. It is the guilt of incongruence, of sensing that one is living beneath the level of one's own perception. That one's inner standards are not being met, not because they are unrealistic, but because they remain untouched by action. Over time, this creates a subtle self-distance, a loss of trust in one's own seriousness, not self-hatred, but a thinning of self-respect, as if part of the self has begun to doubt whether the rest will ever follow through on what it so clearly sees. And so the uncomfortable question takes shape. When understanding becomes deeper than living, does it remain wisdom, or does it slowly turn into a quiet form of self-betrayal? The uncomfortable comfort of remaining prepared, yet immobile. Eventually, immobility stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like a position, not a chosen one, not openly defended, but quietly inhabited. There is a strange comfort in being prepared without being exposed, in knowing that you could act if necessary, while never having to test that belief against reality. Preparation becomes a kind of shelter. It offers structure without risk, intention without consequence. Books read, ideas refined, perspectives sharpened. All of it creates the sense of progress without the vulnerability of movement. Nothing is lost, nothing is committed, nothing is irreversibly shaped. This comfort is not pleasant. It carries a constant undertone of dissatisfaction, a low-level awareness that something essential is being postponed. But it is familiar, and familiarity has its own gravity. The known discomfort feels safer than the unknown exposure of action. In this space, stillness begins to feel responsible, almost strategic, as if waiting preserves quality, coherence, depth. Action, by contrast, appears noisy, messy, prematurely concrete. So restraint disguises itself as discernment. What makes this state particularly difficult to leave is that it does not feel like avoidance. It feels like alignment in progress, like standing just outside the moment of entry, convinced that stepping in now would dilute something important. Over time, however, preparation becomes circular. It no longer leads toward action, it replaces it. The self remains intact, untested, internally rich, and quietly static. A life held in readiness, but never quite released. So the question lingers without urgency, yet without rest. At what point does being prepared stop serving life and start becoming a way of never having to meet it? The reflective void of knowing the prison is internal, yet not simple to cross. When the pattern becomes clear, something shifts, not relief, because clarity does not automatically loosen the grip, but a sharper kind of discomfort. You begin to see that the obstacle is not primarily external. It is not a lack of opportunity, not even a lack of ability. It is an internal arrangement that keeps reproducing itself, and that recognition can feel strangely hollow, because if the prison is internal, then escape should be simple. Yet it isn't. The mind understands the structure and still cannot step outside it. Knowledge becomes a witness rather than a lever. This is where many capable people feel the deepest quiet. a kind of reflective void where explanations are no longer satisfying. You can name the mechanisms, analysis, self-monitoring, ideal comparison, and still feel them operating, as if the very act of seeing has become another layer of the trap. The emptiness here is not despair. It is the absence of illusion, the moment when you can no longer pretend you are almost ready, yet you also cannot honestly say you are choosing to remain still. You are simply inside a pattern that feels more complex than willpower can solve. Philosophers have hinted at this problem in different languages. The split between understanding and being, the tension between consciousness and immediacy, the way self-awareness, meant to deepen life, can also distance you from it. Not as a dramatic tragedy, but as a slow separation. And so the most unsettling part is not that you are trapped, it is that you are lucid inside the trap. You can see the bars, describe their shape, even trace how they formed, and still feel their presence when you try to move. So the question that remains is not, how do you break free? Because that question already smells like a solution. The question is quieter, heavier, and harder to dismiss. If the prison is internal, what part of you is still guarding it? And what would it cost to stop? What emerges after all these layers is not an answer, but a pattern. A way of being in the world where thought grows faster than movement, where awareness refines itself until it becomes a boundary. Nothing here is accidental. Nothing is simple. And that is precisely what makes it difficult to leave. The mind remains active, articulate, alert. It can describe the trap without collapsing into it. Yet, description alone does not dissolve structure. Understanding does not automatically become passage. Sometimes it only deepens the silence around what has not been lived. There is no clear rupture in this condition, no dramatic turning point, only the quiet persistence of a question that refuses to resolve itself. A question that lingers not at the level of motivation, but at the level of identity. Perhaps the unease you feel is not a signal to fix anything. Perhaps it is simply the sound of consciousness noticing its own limits. Not as a failure, but as a threshold it does not yet know how to cross. For now all that remains is attention, not toward solutions, but toward the way stillness keeps repeating itself, toward what is preserved by waiting and what is slowly lost. The reflection does not end here. It only pauses and continues quietly in the next thought you hesitate to act on.